Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of November, and wow, over the past 4 days there have been many events that have unfolded, many updates that we're going to cover today. In particular, in the eastern part of Zaporizhia, the Russian forces have been able to completely overrun the Yancho River line and develop a rapid advance westwards towards the next line of villages, and that ends and coalesces around Hulepoli. So the Haichu River line is now within the Russian crosshairs and is in grave danger. We're also going to look, of course, at an update from the Pokrovsk-Mirhad agglomeration. That will be another key emphasis in today's video. In addition, we're looking at numerous other changes near Novopavlivka, in Konstantinivka, in the Chasiv Yar region even, Seversk, Vovchansk, and Kupiansk. So let's begin and just zoom in on the updates from Zaporizhia and also some from Dnipro, which are also really important to the development of the story. So since about November 9th, the Russian forces have been embarking upon a really rapid pace advance west of the Yancho River. As you guys can see, that by the 9th of November, the Russian side was able to coalesce control over both ends of the riverbank, giving them the necessary positions by which they could expand. And that is something they were able to do because the Ukrainians simply lack the wherewithal on the ground to hold out any longer. And that's in part due to the fact that there were not sufficient trenches, but it also is largely a manpower issue. The Ukrainians, they are defending this sector of the front line, and we'll measure it with the measuring stick over here. I would say from, say, Hulepoli to Pokrovsk, it's about 40 kilometers. This area is guarded by the 20th Army Corps, but it would be a disservice to the definition of an Army Corps to call it such, because in reality, it is much smaller, and even within the formation where you have the individual brigades, those are not anywhere close to being at full strength when you look at the manpower on the ground. And so that's going to really get accentuated as we get into the details of the story. And once you combine that with the fact that they are, of course, relying upon static defenses to hold out, you actually have to gauge what kind of defenses the Ukrainians have over here. So they have these trenches that are a part of the first line of defense protecting Zaporizhia, but those are not actually meant to defend across the front line that is currently laid out. And so the Russians were able to exploit a lot of open locations, a lot of porous gaps in the defense, in the line of contact, and they did not even have to overrun trenches for the most part. But even if they did, the Ukrainians simply weren't present when they were there. And so it was actually a bit of a benefit to the Russians because the Russians could end up utilizing it for their own purposes. So either way, the crux of the issue is related to the quantity of forces in this region, which even after some reinforcements were sent in, beginning in the summer period of 2025, that has been nowhere near enough. And so the Russian forces, of course, they were able to continue with their momentum west of the river, as we've been warning for months now, and were able to immediately arrive at the village of Solotke. And there is the video from the Russian side confirming the capture and going through the details of how they were able to take it over. So this is from November 10th. The 394th Motor Regiment, they took it over. They claimed, and this is again all claims, you don't have to believe it, but they claim to have destroyed, quote unquote, 40 Ukrainian soldiers. So that's killed or wounded, 9 private vehicles, and 5 armored vehicles. So that's also a key theme in many of these compilation clips. The Russian side isn't just taking over these territories, but they're also in the process targeting individual Ukrainian squads that are utilizing either some sort of light armored vehicle or just using a truck or some private vehicle to move around a couple of kilometers away from the front line, especially along this highway that connects Hulepoli to Pokrovsk. And that's where the Russian drone crews, especially the ones using fiber optics, are picking off these troops before they can even make it to the line of contact. And so that also gets sort of forgotten in the broader equation of what's going on over here. But regardless, 394, you can see them on the map over here, their icon, they took it over. And within the context of this entire advance, it's actually one of many villages that has fallen in recent days. There was also the capture of Nove, which made a lot of headlines because it was done by the 114th Motor Rifle Regiment. They have not really been mentioned much in recent months, but it appears as if now they have been completed when it comes to their rest and rotation period. They're back on the line of contact, and they're now engaged in some of the heaviest fighting in this region. So they took over Nove, and there was actually a fear of an encirclement for 2 battalions, or at least elements of 2 battalions, that were holding out in locations directly south of Novomykolaiivka, because Novomykolaiivka had already fallen into Russian hands when it comes to the perimeter and actual residential areas. But just south of it, you have some farmland and a lot of trenches. So the Ukrainians, at least a couple dozen of them, were holed up in this region, and the Russians simply bypassed them because they advanced from Uspanivka to Nove, and also from Novovasilivska into that village. And at the same time, you had the push for west of Poltavka through open fields just to the south of Novouspanivska, and the Russians were able to capture that village as well. And so the Ukrainians, they were put in this quagmire situation where they were sandwiched in between two vectors, and they withdrew in the last moments. So there was no physical encirclement, but there was a scare, and that would have led to a larger rout had they not been able to withdraw in time. And so the Ukrainians from these two particular battalions, you could actually guess them because I have them on the map over here. You have the 79th Battalion of the 102nd Ivano-Frankivsk TDF Brigade. That's one. And then you also have the 142nd Mechanized Brigade. One of his battalions was involved in defense over here. So the 142nd is one of these units that is, playing a predominant role in the defense of the eastern flank of Hulaypoli, in addition to the 102nd, although much of the brigade isn't actually operating over here right now because it's also responsible for holding the southern flank of Hulaypoli. And regardless, when you look at the details of the assault companies of the linear battalions, you just go through the effective amount of manpower, the people that are actually holding the line. The numbers are really dwindling within this unit. It's not a strong unit in terms of its quality or training or anything of the sort, but also in terms of the amount of men over here. So that's an issue that has to be addressed, and it only can be addressed by sending in reinforcements from some sort of external units, which is something that has not been done yet. The areas where it has been done is in a location slightly to the north. So we'll get to that in a moment. When it comes to the final result and what's ended up as the result of the Russian advances west of the Yancha River, is that any sort of intermediary line between the Yancha and Haicha River is now a pipe dream, because the Russians have already been able to take over all of the intermediary obstacles that could have theoretically been used to stall the advance, and it's been done in a record amount of time. So the Russians advanced about 12 kilometers to the west in total, and have two polygons over here, one amounting to 11.6 square kilometers and another amounting to nearly 65 square kilometers, just to give you guys an idea of the scale. And this is within a couple of days. So in total, you're looking at over 76, nearly 77 square kilometers of territory captured in this one location alone, one continuous part of the front line alone, not to mention the Danylivka advance that we'll look at later on. So this includes, of course, the contribution of the 114th, but also the 14th Special Purpose Brigade, 1,461st TDF, or not TDF, but Territorial Motor Rifle Brigade, 60th Motor Rifle Brigade, and a couple of other units that you can see I'm just clicking on over here. And a lot of these units, they operate in tandem, so they're just designated tasks to capture one village, and then another unit captures the other in parallel. And sometimes it also rotates. And so the Russians have a pretty strong force over here within the context of the 36th Combined Arms Army and also the 127th Motor Rifle Division. And they've been able to manage the load really perfectly when you think about it. And as a result, let's measure it. The Russians are very close to arriving at Hulaypoli. They're only 6.5 kilometers away from the northeastern outskirts, and they've already been able to advance about 7.5 kilometers southwestwards from Uspanivka. And when you look at the density of fortifications, as they get closer and closer, yes, the density of Ukraine's defenses does become more noticeable. And that will help, to, at least to a certain extent, in slowing down the amount of Russian gains. And not only because of the defenses, but also due to the fact that, once you get closer to an urban cluster, that's closer to the center of gravity for the Ukrainian defenders. So there's a larger manpower pool in this particular area. But either way, it's still something that will play a massive role in shaping the course of the battle, because we used to look at it, the entire eastern flank that was supposed to serve as this massive buffer, massive stalwart against a massive attack by the Russians, it's now been undermined in a very fast period of time. And it's not just the areas to the northeast, but also directly to the east that are now being bypassed, and there's a danger of them being enveloped or squeezed out. So Vesele, Zeleny High, Vysoké, these are still locations where you have holdouts from the Ukrainian end, not many, but they are still holding out in these locations. So they can also be squeezed because they're being involved from the south, east, and north now with the recent advances. So certainly keep an eye out for that. The Russians are also advancing, and this is done intentionally along this particular paved road. So that's how they were able to arrive at Yablunkove and also at Rivnopilia, so another really important intermediary village. And from there, they can organize forces in an area where there are basements. So that's when you see the buildup of assault platoons. And then from there, they can either advance using private vehicles or motorcycles along this road and try to infiltrate into northern Huleapoli itself. That's another real palpable concern right now. And the Russian forces were able to advance, not necessarily having to do this complete circle around the entire perimeter of the High Chur River line to arrive at Huleapoli. They were able to really just skip that step and arrive at Huleapoli directly from the northeast along this route, which is something that certainly was possible, but the Ukrainians would have hoped to prevent it simply due to the fact that they had forces deployed west of the river. But upon contact, upon having to deal with the brunt of a Russian advance, the garrison over here that the Ukrainians had fielded simply was not enough. And it's certainly not enough now as the Russians are getting very close to the city of Huleapoli itself. And so the eastern flank of Huleapoli is a location that's definitely worth looking at. The northeastern flank is, of course, now in its really worst catastrophic state. And you have now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new villages captured by the Russians, which will be used as staging points to reach the High Chur line, and not just Huleapoli, but also locations northwards, and also the various areas that are connected to the road in this area. And from there, you can really move the front line and have a permanent shift of about, let's say, 15 kilometers if we're being generous, if not even more in certain cases. And that completely undermines the first and second lines of defense built by the Ukrainians to absorb assaults towards Zaporizhia. A lot of these defenses that were supposed to lead to thousands of Russian casualties by building them in such a way where they would be able to absorb a Russian assault head on, a lot of these areas, that not only because they're unmanned, but also because they were built in a way that did not anticipate an assault from the east, now they're just completely superfluous and being taken over without a fight. And so the theoretical amount of casualties would be exponentially higher than what we're actually seeing on the ground right now due to the decision making and the vectors of assault that the Russian forces and command over here ended up choosing. And it all goes back to the capture of Vuhledar that we talked about at the time. And I was, really warning of the fact that there's a massive gap in fortifications that spans from Vuhledar all the way to the Velika Novosilka area. And that was exploited by the Russians back then. That was in October of 2024 when they took over Vuhledar and were able to then go on this spree of just continually advancing westwards through open fields, through key roads, all the way to Velika Novosilka. And then from there, using that as the next organizational node to continue with that westwards advance through areas that are also rather thin when it comes to organized defenses. And that's how they were able to build up the initial, massive strike force that was able to overcome all the defenses along the Mokriali River and reach the border with Dnipro. And instead of getting fixated on Dnipro and the Ukrainian attempted counterattacks over there, the Russians simply shifted their focus to another area where they saw that there were massive gaps. And that was south of the Vavch River. And that includes the border region between Dnipro and Zaporizhia that we see right now. And that's when the campaign started around August of 2024, or 2025, sorry. And now this Russian movement has turned into a completely independent sector and theater because there is a potential of overrunning Huleapoli. There's potential of overrunning this entire vertical portion of the second line of defense, which was built, and really a lot of time and effort was invested into setting it up. And now it's within imminent threats of being touched and being assaulted by the Russian side, at least along certain points. And the fear is that this would just continue getting worse and worse, that the situation just continually deteriorates for the Ukrainians over here. And I am of the belief that there will always be vicissitudes, and so in some periods of time, depending on the Russian command's decisions, depending on the amount of reinforcement sent, depending on where the front line sort of stabilizes, there are going to be times where momentum is higher than others. And so this is not something that's going to occur at any sort of constant rate or even an exponential one. It's going to occur in sort of major outbursts. And so this is one of them. But the point I'm trying to get at is that the Russians, with this direction, they're heading towards Zaporizhia from the east. And that's certainly a part of their thinking now. They're certainly thinking that they can overrun the defenses built by the Ukrainians already prepared. And the goal would be to arrive at Zaporizhia's eastern flank before the Ukrainians can build up sufficient defenses to absorb precision attack from the east. Because right now, the Ukrainians are cognizant of these problems. And you can see over here on the map, they're beginning to construct defenses. And these defenses are nowhere near the current front line. It's almost as if they're anticipating that they're going to cede over the next year a massive chunk of territory, a massive chunk of open fields, and also medium-sized villages in the hinterlands between, say, over here, Danylivka, all the way to Andreyivka over here, for instance. So this is like a 50-kilometer area where there is already an anticipation that a lot of territory is going to be traded. And the goal would be to at least protect the line past that point. And I suppose this region over here, where you have a Dnipro border southwards all the way up until Kumyshyvacha and the front line in the Zaporizhia region. So that's the current Ukrainian backup plan if, the worst case scenario continues to unfold in the way it has already. So that's something that we need to be made aware of, even though it's not particularly relevant for now. What's really relevant for now is the way in which the Russians go about capturing Hulepli and the Ukrainian attempts at stabilizing afterwards. Where can they actually stabilize the line for now? That's a really important question, because the Haichu River line is appearing to be very flimsy because the Russian forces have already been able to take over Danylivka. So we warned about this in either a video from last week or 2 weeks ago, the fact that the Russian DRGs were already making an effort in a mad dash towards Danylivka from Vishneve, and that arriving at it would cut off the road connectivity between Pokrovsk and Hulepli, of course, in a direct manner. There are other ways to arrive, but it's completely different. It's way longer and less effective. And so now we've seen that the Russians completely, understood why this is an important location and focused all of their efforts on this narrow corridor specifically, advancing south of the Yancha River. So they captured 7.8 square kilometers of territory, and we have here the unit that did it. It was embarked upon by the 5th Tank Brigade, and there's geolocation, and this is from November 13th. So the 5th Tank Brigade, they claim to have cleared out 150 houses within Danylivka and destroyed a company-sized formation. That's what they claim, and destroyed, again, killed or wounded. And this is from the 154th Mechanized Brigade. They also claimed to have destroyed 12 howitzers, armored vehicles, and tanks in total. So from the 154th Brigade, this is interesting. It's one of these reinforcement units that was moved in around August. I was actually the first person to report on it, I think in English, because I was reading the Ukrainian missing persons reports, and I stumbled upon the unit being moved. And since then, it's played a critical role in at least dragging out the fighting for as long as possible. You can imagine that it would have been far worse without them, because you look at the caliber of units over here, and it's only rivaled by the 110th, which has its own manpower issues because it's continually been sent towards areas with the highest attrition rates and sent to act as a vanguard force. But the 110th Brigade, it's gone through several rounds of reformation and restructuring, because after these major battles, the core of the unit is essentially either killed or wounded or is in some way incapacitated, so they're not fighting anymore on the front line. And so then all the new mobilized people, they're just sent to this part of the armed forces of Ukraine. They're moved and fast-tracked to this particular units. And so these are the two higher caliber units within this region. And so the 3rd Battalion of the 154th was supposed to be holding on in Danylivka. For whatever reason, they abandoned their post, and there was a question as to whether this was done on the sort of whims, on the command of the leadership within the battalion or brigade, or whether this was something that happened spontaneously due to forces on the ground not feeling confident enough in this area. Either way, they did withdraw, and that gave the Russians an opportunity to assault this area with very little resistance. Now, with this consolidation, the road has been cut off to Hulepli, and there's now the platform by which to advance southwards and capture, first of all the open fields east of the road in the Haichu River. There's not enough Ukrainian forces on the ground. There are no trenches, and the only thing left would be tree lines and drones, before the Russians can actually seize all of these areas. And so that's going to be on the docket. And then accompanying that would be the capture of all the various villages that are running along the road over here. So they would naturally fall into Russian hands, coinciding with an assault on Hulepoli. And then from there, you already arrive at the vertical line of defense that is meant to prevent any sort of expansionism westwards into the sort of the heartland of northern Zaporizhia. So that's the fear right now. And the Russians are unlocking it via the assault and entrance into Danylivka. I don't want to get ahead of myself when it comes to, using big arrows or zooming out too much, but that is a general direction in which the state of affairs is headed. And the only way that we could change that assessment would be with the Ukrainians presenting some sort of off ramp. And for now, they haven't done that because these reinforcements that we talk about, they are largely associated with what's going on in the Zaporizhia pockets, or are in some way trying to alleviate the siege of Mirnorod or the near siege of the city, or somehow still operating in Pokrovsk, because that's where a lot of the most recent reserves that have been moved from one place to another are actually operating right now. There's not much left of any sort of notable quality, anything really, even a lower barrel, sort of bottom of the barrel tier is actually available for a major defensive operation. But in any case, here we can see that there is the location south of Novopavlivka. Again, this is something we were warning about. We were talking about how the Russian garrison south of Pokrovsk was downscaling for months, and they were moving their assets east and south of Novopavlivka. And that includes the 90th Guards Tank Division, which has been involved in sort of pioneering the advance across the Vavcha River in this area. And now they have almost been able to get control over a massive platform south of Novopavlivka, but actually also a bridgehead across the river. So the Russians over here captured 19.4 square kilometers. They were able to advance about 5 kilometers northwards in this case. And there's a video from November 11th of the Perun unit within the 42nd Mechanized Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto dugouts north of Dakhny where Russian soldiers were present. So now it's only a matter of seeing whether there are still Ukrainian vestiges holding out in between Filia and Dakhny, which may not be the case, but I have learned over the years not to discount the Ukrainians' ability to hold out in very narrow pockets and within these, geometrically rare shapes that, are very flimsy when it comes to their escape corridor. But regardless, the Ukrainians do use them as a means of distracting the Russian side, getting them to focus all of their wherewithal across a broader part of the front line because of the way in which it's shaped. And that serves as a distraction from what would be the main objective, that being Novopavlivka. In any case, though, we don't know one way or another. And so that's why I'm waiting. And here we have the anti-tank ditch that was built in a horizontal manner from Filia all the way to the border with Donetsk. And so that's an area where you do have some degree of fortifications, but for the most part, the span of defenses has been taken over by the Russian side. So they have the opportunity to close this particular gap, and then they would be rather close to Novopavlivka, and they would have already this sort of base and operating point across the river that can be used to begin launching assaults onto Novopavlivka from the south. So that's one route, but I don't think it's going to be the only one, to be honest, just simply due to the troop deployments and due to the fact that the Ukrainians will try to gauge the areas where the situation is the worst, and that's where they'll, of course, focus all of their might, and so then that will open up opportunities elsewhere. That's my personal opinion of the way in which this is going to unfold. But you can already see how the entire motion is in play. Looking at the Pokrovsk region, this is where I'm going to turn off the fortification map because it has slightly less utility. But the Russians advanced north of Kotlina, capturing 1.56 square kilometers of territory. The advance is about 2 kilometers northwards, and so the Russians over here getting close yet again to the E50 highway from another location, although it doesn't have that much importance right now because the E50 highway just leads into Russian-controlled parts of Pokrovsk. But the goal would be, I suppose, to just clear out all of these trenches and tree lines where you do still have a notable Ukrainian presence, and then begin putting pressure directly on Hrishny. Because Hrishny right now is acting as this feeding point for Ukrainian reinforcements before they arrive at the intense battles within Pokrovsk itself, as you guys can see over here. So the goal would just be to shift the focus away from the agglomeration of Miran and Pokrovsk, and then have the Ukrainians focusing on the rear by assaulting Grishny from the south. That could be the logic behind the operation. In any case, though, we do have a bit of an update from the city itself because there are three new changes. One, within the Shcher-Bakovka district, the Russians have been able to capture 24 hectares, so they advanced slightly northwards, about 500 meters northwards. And there's a video over here of the Skala Regiment as they cleared out houses in this location on November 12th. So the 2nd Assault Battalion of Skala's regiment, they are operating in this area, and that's including in Shcher-Bakovka, also the 8th district and Dinas over here, and Karakovsky as well. So that those are the zones of operation for this particular battalion. You also, of course, have elements of the Special Operations Center East that are involved in the efforts to drag out the fighting. And there are a few other notable examples, like the 1st Battalion of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. That's another notable case. They were pulled from the reserves. I think it's of the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps, 8th, one of them. In any case, though, you also have the 137th Marine Battalion of the 35th Marine Brigade, which should be stationed in Novopavlivka, but one of its battalions has been moved over to this more critical section of the front line, in addition to its associated drone unit, the Hydra units. So you have them, and the drone support is also coming from the 68th Aegir Brigade, but I do think the 68th Brigade in recent days has moved even more of its forces, whether they're actual infantrymen on the ground or drone crews. They've continually been trying to move their forces away from the agglomeration, and so previously we saw a lot of activity from 68th Jaeger near Novopavlivka, near the rail line east of Pokrovsk, near Rog and Hnativka, and even Rivne. But now they continually are moving northwards in terms of the geolocations of where their videos are filmed. And there have also been some escaped attempts, but they've not been directly attributed to the 68th. In any case, though, it does appear as if the remaining operators from this unit, drone operators in this case, they're located in areas that are farther away from the absolute dregs of the pocket and salient. But let's zoom in over here and look at another advance, because here south of Rivne, 24 square kilometers was captured by the Russian side. November 12th, 30th Marine Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry south of Rivne. So there's currently an effort, and this is one of the most intense battles within Pokrovsk right now. It's over the Dinas district. There's a push from the north to close the salient, which includes all these apartment complexes within Dinas. And then there's also this effort from open areas by the Russian side, specifically from the 506th Motor Rifle Regiment, to attack, I think this is the concrete store, or maybe it's one of the other facilities, because I know there's also a meatpacking plant in this area. But in any case, the Russian side is pursuing an assault from the southeast as well. So they entered into the industrial zone, took it over for the most parts, and now they're trying to cut off the road connectivity between Murad and the Ukrainian remnants within Pokrovsk. And of course, Rivne serves as a conduit as well. So that's another location that they're trying to essentially sever off. So that's a part of the current Russian approach. We can also see over here that the excess open fields and trenches that are located southeast of the city are now fully under Russian control. You can't even see the trenches over here within this part of the map, but they do exist. It's just not something that was seen in satellite imagery, perhaps because they're dug directly under the tree line. In any case, though, this is 2.8 square kilometers of territory captured, and then advanced eastwards of about 1.5 kilometers. Now, again, the status of Danylivka Sukhiyar is not clear, but I would be confident in saying that the 25th Brigade is likely withdrawn from this area almost entirely. Maybe there are some very minimal vanguard forces still holding on, and that is being done in order to ensure that there is still a massive buffer zone between the southern tip and then the rest of the Ukrainian garrison in the center of the city. So that's something to keep in mind. You can see over here south of the Terracon for Mine 5/6, about 12.4 hectares of territory was captured. It's an advance of about 400 or 500 meters. So there is a bit of a slogfest within southern Murad. There's obviously all these massive clips of the Fab 1500s and maybe even some Fab 3000s, but I would be doubtful of some of those labelings. that are being utilized on the major apartment complexes in Murad, of which there are several. You can see over here to the south near Velitia, Odeska, there's one. You can see the connecting point between south and north. There's also a complex over there. And then, of course, you have the infamous Moldejny microdistrict where you have all these apartment buildings, push the ones within the city center. And so there are a lot of locations where there could theoretically be Ukrainian forces stationed, and they could be used as forward sniper posts or vantage observation posts. And so that's a part of the logic behind the Fab strikes. Although I don't think many of them are Fab 3000s because of the weight that it brings upon the jet, and the fact that the job of a Fab 3000 can be done by two Fab 1500s that will be dropped at the same time by the same jets, and it would be more accurate and would likely cause more damage within the desired location. So that's why I don't see much of it. I suppose it's a good idea when you want to concentrate strike on a generally large location, but with the maximum amount of explosive yield. So that would be the best practice. Now, the Ukrainians, they're trying to alleviate the situation, and this is being done in several ways, but it really does all go back to Rodinske, as we've said numerous times, because Rodinske is the essential key that ensures that there's still a level of connectivity between Munirad and the Ukrainian rear. And so the corridor is about 2.6 kilometers, but the Ukrainians, they've been able to ensure that the Russians don't really solidify control over their northern tip of this corridor because they're in this back and forth in southern Rodinska. And so they've been able to so far capture about 36 hectares of territory within this location. And that's in the southwestern pockets of Rodinska as well. The Russians advanced over here as well, and it's a relatively minor advance, but there's a geolocation. So this is from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. They dropped grenades on the houses in this particular location. And when it comes to the breakdown of who's in control of what, you can say that the southwest is, Ukrainian controlled, newly taken over. The north is either a gray zone or fully Ukrainian controlled. It's not really clear because there's almost never footage from this area, but I would assume that it is Ukrainian controlled. And then the center and southeast are locations where you see more Russians because they were entering from Chivony Liman, and then from there it took this detour to the northeast, or perhaps they were involved in the capture initially of the massive minefield over here in Slakeep, and then from there were sent directly towards the Rodinsk area, where you also have these massive duplexes and massive building complexes. I don't know whether they are considered these high rises or not, because I don't think they actually meet the requirements. But either way, it is a large structure, and they are partially under Russian control. But as long as the Ukrainians can offer this resistance, especially from the south, then that will create the seeds of doubt needed in order to drag out the fighting for as long as possible, and then also withdraw when the return on investment is simply not worth it. Also over here with Zatishok, this is again a part of the effort to, cave in on Rodinska, because the goal would be to establish this strong Ukrainian flank from the north, and from there to hook around southwards and begin to cut off the logistics networks between the rear, whatever that may be, and then the northern sections and whatever is remaining of Rodinska at that particular point in time. But when we can see over here, it's about 5.77 square kilometers of territory taken. There's a geolocation from November 11th of the Russians shelling tree lines south of Zatishok, which backs up the claims that the Ukrainians are stationed over here and have taken over the village of Zatishok, which is something that I know a lot of Russian sources were aware of and acknowledged for a week. And I was very hesitant because there was no proof provided. Now this is the first time I'm seeing proof. So, of course, I've changed my classification of the situation, and it's also in advance of about 3 kilometers to the east at the same time. Now, with Shachove, you can see that there is this advance of about 1 square kilometer, and this is from November 10th. A soldier from the 163rd Tank Regiment, they cleared out on eastern Shachove and were engaged in small arms clashes with the Ukrainian end, and so that just gives us the indication of the furthest Russian advance in this specific location. In Konstantinivka as well, we can see that the Russians advanced south of the Adhidka dachas, first and foremost, but also south of Staraya Derevnya. And from here, they arrived at the northern sections of Ivanopilia. So this is the capture of 0.75 square kilometers of territory, and it's an advance southwards of about 1 kilometer. And this northern part of Ivanopilia includes the Krivy River. It includes the key road connecting to Danylivka, and you also have, of course, the warehouses over here. They're very narrow in terms of their width. They don't really span much, but there are still a lot of these large warehouses and storage facilities as well, and a couple of residential areas. So that's essentially the Russian extent of advance in this area. Now, to look up at what's going on in Chasiv Yar, there are two updates going both ways. So the Ukrainians, starting around early October, embarked upon a campaign to clear out excess Russian territory that had been taken over but was not really being addressed, was not really being strengthened. And so you had, of course, this Ukrainian units come in and take it back. So this is the capture of its 1.25 square kilometers of territory taken back by the Ukrainians, and this is from November 9th. They conducted grenade drops to push out the Russian individuals that were still holed up within the Levanevsky microdistrict in this area, which is one of these southeastern pockets within Chasiv Yar, as you can see over here. Now, with Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians, their fear has always been that the capture of such a major city and the importance of it, because it is located on high ground due to the Donbass Canal, and then from there can sort of feed into the disparity between the higher elevation locations in Chasiv Yar and then the lower elevation areas like the Krivy River and whatever sort of settlement is located within it. And so a major fear has always been and still is for the Russians to just directly assault from the east and overrun some of the defenses, because there are some obstacles, but there are obviously routes of bypassing it and then arriving in the northeastern flank of Danylivka. And so that's something that is really concerning for the Ukrainians, and that's why they've been trying to try to formulate a new line of contact that is more conducive for defensive operations. So we can see it over here with this area, and you can see that from the geolocations as well. Now, the Russian side, they've also been able to advance south of Maiska and to the west of Hrivka in this case. So 7.5 square kilometers of territory was taken over, and as you guys can see, that is an advance, if we're measuring it northwards, of about 3.5 kilometers. And let's say if it's going to be some sort of foreign advance, it's about 4.5 kilometers in either direction. You can see the geolocation over here of the 56th Motorized Brigade. They targeted a 20-man Russian assault squad. That's what they claimed. And this occurred as they were approaching Markovet. And so, again, another video from November 12th. But it is important to understand the meaning of this crossing, because for a very long time there have not been a new initiative to cross over the Donbass Canal. Of course, it still happens in areas where there's already a bridgehead, but now it's being expanded for the first time in a while, and it amounts to 7.5 square kilometers of territory taken over. Northwards, it's a movement of around 3.5 kilometers to the north, and then to the west, it's about 4.5 kilometers. So you guys can see that there is this video from November 12th of that targeting process against those 20 men, and as you guys, the 56th Motorized Brigade, they actually targeted that 20-man grouping as they were, approaching houses within Markovet, and so it happened to be one of them. So that's pretty much what it is when it comes to the polygon over here. But I do want to move on to what's going on within Seversk. As you guys can see, southeast Seversk is falling again at a large rate. You can see that there is this video from November 9th. It's from the Zaporizhia Battalion of the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade. And you can see how there's a sapper that detonates explosive within this Ukrainian trench. And this is, again, southeast of the town. And this is a strategy that's been commonly employed by the other side within this part of the front line especially, which is to send out some sort of advance. But when you look at the statistics over here, and we'll also look at the advanced diagonally, it's about 3 kilometers, and 3 kilometers northwest of the current line of contact would be, of course, the western outskirts of Seversk near the end of that entire operation. Now, when we look over here, there was actually a compilation released recently by the 3rd Army Corps where they show their activities and their attempts to repel attacks from the Russian side. And some of the footage actually shows there was activity right near Dorbysheva, just to the north of it. And so that's an area that is certainly compromised. At the same time, Seredny has been taken over in its entirety, 5.7 square kilometers of territory taken over as well, and it's in advance of, let's measure it, 4.5 or 5 kilometers in either direction. And so Seredny is one of the villages over here that's very important in the sense that it can unlock access to all the other small individual businesses, or not businesses, but settlements that are located east of the Oska River and are connected via these road networks that may not be the highest caliber, but you can see them over here marked on the map that are used for the day-to-day movement. And just to briefly finish off with Kupiansk, because yet again, I'm nearing that time of day where completely out of it. I'm not even thinking. I'm just an NPC. But you guys can see that over here in southern Kharkiv, 1.07 square kilometers of territory was taken over by the Russian side. And this is within the Kolontaevka district of southern Kupiansk from the 9th of November. It's an advance southwards amounting to about 1.75 square kilometers. And so there are still some remnants of the Ukrainian force on the western bank of Kupiansk. For instance, this southernmost tip where you have the forest and then a couple of houses, and some of them may also be dachas, this still is within the perimeter of Kupiansk. Moreover, you have the center where the area is just south of downtown and south of the central market. Those are areas that still include a lot of density when it comes to the amount of houses and basements and other industrial facilities or other warehouses or places of work, regardless of what it is. This is another area that's pretty large and does still offer a lot of these sort of structures and buildings. And so that's another location that has to be cleared out. And then you also have the Jubilee apartment, which is an area where you have, these high rises that can be used to dominate the entirety of the battlefield, regardless of the other elevation points, other elevation metrics, as forces advance and move closer and closer to the river valley within the center of Kupiansk. That too does. And now to finish it off, looking at Vovchansk, we can see there are 2 updates. First and foremost, we can see that there is this advance amounting to nearly 10 hectares, and there's a video from November 9th of the 2nd Battalion of the 57th Motorized Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto the Zavody 2 residential area within Vovchansk, which is a part of the southeastern section of the Vovchansk agglomeration. Over here, you can see the capture of 36 hectares, and there is over here on November 11th footage of 3rd Battalion of 57th Motorized Brigade dropping grenades onto 2 Russian soldiers as they were entering into a trench over here north of Sinelnikove. So those are 2 separate examples, but have the effect of weeding out the spare locations where there may be a very limited degree of resistance. So that could be over here. It could be within this area just south of the forested plantations and south of the Vovch River. But in any case, that's pretty much it, to be honest. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll try to be more consistent with the uploads and less lethargic with them. But that's just completely dependent on what happens during the week. And so I can't guarantee anything for now. But at least for tomorrow I can. So that's the good news. And so thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video, and goodbye.